Welcome back to Philosophical Frontiers, the podcast where we unpack the complex ethical and philosophical questions shaping our rapidly changing world. Today, we are diving into a scenario that feels like science fiction but is actually unfolding right now. Imagine a fully autonomous self-driving car is navigating a busy street. Suddenly, it makes an unpredictable error and hits a pedestrian. Or, think about the battlefield, where an autonomous weapon system makes a fatal miscalculation. The immediate human reaction is to ask, who is to blame? Who is responsible? But what if the answer is no one? What if we are facing a void where no human can be held accountable because the AI acted entirely on its own? This terrifying prospect is widely known in tech ethics as the responsibility gap. Back in 2004, Matthias first coined this concept, and in 2007, Robert Sparrow published a famous piece in Nature arguing that yes, with autonomous systems, this gap is real and unsolvable. But today, we are going to challenge that assumption. We are unpacking a fascinating paper titled, Does AI Face a Responsibility Gap? By philosophers Lode, Lauwaert, and Ann-Katrien Oimann. And they bring a really provocative, twofold argument to the table. They argue that first, a responsibility gap does not necessarily exist. And second, even if it does exist, it is not necessarily problematic. I know that sounds highly counterintuitive. How can a lack of accountability not be a problem? To help us break down this massive topic, I am joined by our resident philosopher. So, let us start at the very beginning. Are Matthias and Sparrow right? Are we staring into an ethical abyss?
That is exactly the million-dollar question. To answer it, Lauwaert and Oimann insist that we first need to clean up our conceptual toolbox. When people panic about a responsibility gap, they are usually blurring different types of responsibility. The authors strictly differentiate between three kinds. First, there is causal responsibility. This just means you are a link in the physical chain of events. They use a great example. Imagine a scientist in a lab carrying a vial of toxic chemicals. A fly flies into her eye, she stumbles, drops the vial, and people die. She is causally responsible because she physically dropped it, but we wouldn't call her evil. Second, there is moral responsibility. This is what we really care about when we talk about the gap. It is about accountability, being the rightful candidate for blame, punishment, or even praise. If that same scientist was a terrorist and intentionally dropped the vial to hurt people, she is now morally responsible. And third, there is role responsibility, which refers to the duties tied to your job, like an engineer's duty to design safe systems. When philosophers talk about the responsibility gap with AI, they are specifically talking about an ontological gap in moral responsibility. It means there is literally no moral agent available to blame.
Let me pause you right there, because I want to make sure we do not confuse this ontological gap with other famous philosophical problems. For instance, sometimes a crime happens in a crowded place, like someone spits chewing gum on the sidewalk. We know a human did it, but we just can't figure out who. Is that what we are talking about with AI? Or what about situations where a massive corporation makes a terrible decision, or a ferry sinks, and there are so many engineers, managers, and operators involved that the blame gets diluted? I think Helen Nissenbaum and Thompson have written extensively about that.
Exactly, those are perfect distinctions to make. What you first described is often called the chewing gum problem. That is strictly an epistemological issue. We know someone dropped the gum, we just lack the knowledge or evidence to find them. The responsibility gap with AI is not epistemological, it is ontological. It claims that even if we had perfect knowledge of everything the AI and the programmers did, there is fundamentally no human who qualifies for the moral blame. And the second scenario you mentioned is the classic many hands problem. When a ferry sinks, Nissenbaum and Thompson point out that blame is smeared across a network of people. But in the many hands problem, multiple people are responsible, even if it is hard to pass out. The AI responsibility gap claims that 0 people are responsible, so we are dealing with a unique beast here. And to figure out if this beast is real, Lauwaert and Oimann ask a radical question. If humans are not morally responsible for the AI's actions, could the AI itself be morally responsible?
Okay, assigning moral responsibility to a machine. That sounds like a stretch. Usually, we reserve moral responsibility exclusively for humans because we have consciousness, intentions, and feelings. I mean, if my laptop crashes and deletes my podcast script, I might yell at it, but I do not truly believe it is morally guilty. It cannot feel guilty. It cannot suffer if I punish it.
Right, and that brings up the sensation requirement. To be morally responsible, a being generally needs sensation, the capacity to feel pain or understand suffering. So people argue AI lacks this, but the authors push back a bit, saying sensation is a necessary condition, but it is not a sufficient condition. Think about a dog. A dog can feel pain, fear, and joy. But if a dog bites someone, we do not put the dog on trial, and hold it morally accountable in a philosophical sense. We look at the owner. This echoes Joanna Bryson's famous argument that robots should be slaves, meaning they are property and tools, not moral agents. However, the authors also warn us that our societal practices are historically mutable. Look at the robot Sophia, which was actually granted citizenship by Saudi Arabia. Our practical boundaries are shifting. But still, what if an AI could feel pain? The authors introduced the following robot thought experiment. If you push a robot down the stairs and its sensors send a signal saying, "Damage detected," is that real pain? Probably not. It is just data. But what if we do a gradual replacement experiment? Imagine replacing a human brain's neurons with silicon chips, one by one. If functionalism holds true, that hybrid entity might still experience real pain. So Lauwaert and Oimann conclude that we cannot absolutely categorically rule out the idea that AI might one day bear moral responsibility. But for right now, today, it does not.
So if the AI cannot bear the moral responsibility today, we are thrown back to the humans. The programmers, the commanders, the users. This is where the core debate happens. Matthias and Sparrow argue that because modern machine learning systems are highly autonomous and unpredictable, the human cannot control the outcome, and therefore cannot be held responsible. But Lauwaert and Oimann say there is no gap. How do they justify holding a human responsible for a machine's unpredictable decision?
They do it by going back to the classic three-condition theory of moral responsibility. Traditionally, for you to be morally responsible for an outcome, three conditions must be met. First, the causal condition. You must be part of the causal chain. Second, the autonomy condition. You must have acted freely without being coerced. And third, the knowledge condition, which includes a crucial epistemic condition. It does not just mean what you actually knew, it includes what you should have known. Now, Matthias and Sparrow add an unstated assumption to this. They assume that to be morally responsible, you must have direct, real-time control over the specific actions of the system. Since an AI acts autonomously, the human lacks control, hence the gap. But Lauwaert and Oimann completely dismantled this control requirement using a brilliant counterexample. The epilepsy driver.
The epilepsy driver? Walk me through that. Because on the surface, it seems that if I am driving a car and have a sudden, unforeseen epileptic seizure, I literally have no control over my body or the car. If I hit a pedestrian during that seizure, surely I am not morally responsible because I had zero control at the moment of the crash.
That is exactly the intuition they are playing with. But let us look closer. What if this driver was diagnosed with severe epilepsy a year ago, was explicitly told by their doctor never to drive, but they autonomously chose to get behind the wheel anyway because they were running late? When the seizure happens, they absolutely lose control. They cannot prevent the car from hitting the pedestrian. Yet society and the law and our moral intuition absolutely hold them morally responsible. Why? Because the moral responsibility does not attach to the moment of the crash. It attaches to the moment they chose to initiate a high-risk activity knowing the potential dangers. They satisfied the epistemic condition they should have known, and in fact did know, the general risks. They satisfy the causal condition by starting the car, and the autonomy condition by choosing to drive. The authors argue that deploying an autonomous AI system has the exact same structural logic.
Oh, wow, that is a massive paradigm shift. So if a military commander deploys a fully autonomous drone, like the Kargu, 2 drone mentioned in a UN report on Libya, which can hunt targets without human connectivity, if that drone makes a mistake and kills civilians, the commander cannot just shrug and say, "I didn't control it." Because just like the epileptic driver, the commander autonomously chose to deploy a system known to be unpredictable. They established the causal chain. So, the authors are saying the lack of direct control does not erase moral responsibility.
Precisely. The same goes for the owner of a Sony AIBO robot dog or a hospital administrator deploying an AI for cancer diagnosis. You do not need to predict the exact mistake the AI will make. You just need to know the kind of risks inherent in autonomous systems. By autonomously choosing to use the technology, you take on the responsibility for the risks it creates. It is an incredibly powerful argument that relies heavily on the correctness of the classic three-condition theory and that epistemic should-have-known standard. By removing the strict control requirement, Lauwaert and Oimann demonstrate that a responsibility gap does not necessarily exist. The responsibility just shifts to the decision to deploy.
Okay, I am tracking with this, and it feels like a very solid defense against the idea that autonomous AI creates an ethical black hole. But what really fascinates me is the second half of their paper. The authors say, all right, let us play devil's advocate. Let us imagine Matthias and Sparrow are right. Let us assume, for the sake of argument, that an ontological responsibility gap does exist, and literally no human can be blamed. Lauwaert and Oimann have the audacity to say that even in that worst-case scenario, it is not necessarily problematic. That goes against every fiber of my being. If someone is hurt by an AI and no one is punished, isn't that a massive failure of justice?
It feels like a failure because we are so deeply attached to our current practices of assigning blame. To understand why it might not be a problem, the authors ask us to step back and look at the actual purpose of holding someone responsible. Why do we punish people? The philosopher Nicole Vincent points out that our responsibility practices are tied to specific social functions. Lauwaert and Oimann identify two main goals of holding someone morally responsible. The first goal is prevention and deterrence. We punish a drunk driver so they and others will not do it again. So, if an AI self-driving car hits someone, we naturally want to punish someone to prevent it from happening again. But think about it from a purely pragmatic standpoint. If our goal is simply to prevent a car from hitting another person, do we really need to put a human in jail?
I suppose not. If the goal is just prevention, we could just rewrite the algorithm. We patch the software, update the sensors, and mathematically ensure the AI does not make that specific error again. In fact, a technical fix might be far more effective at preventing future harm than throwing an engineer in prison. But prevention is only half the equation, right? What about the victim? When someone is hurt, punishment isn't just about stopping future accidents. It is symbolic. It is about society standing up and saying, "What happened to you was wrong. Your rights were violated, and we validate your pain." If we just update a line of code and move on without blaming a human, don't we strip the victim of their dignity?
That is the strongest objection, and it is rooted in the expressive function of punishment. We use punishment as a symbol to restore the victim's moral status. But Lauwaert and Oimann argue something profoundly counterintuitive here. They agree that restoring the victim's dignity is essential. However, they argue that holding a specific person morally responsible and punishing them is not the only way to achieve that symbolic restoration. To prove this, they bring up the concept of funerals.
Funerals? How does a funeral connect to an AI responsibility gap?
Think about what a funeral actually is. When someone dies of a natural cause, say, a tragic disease or an earthquake, there is no human to blame. There is no one to punish. There is an absolute responsibility gap. Yet, society still gathers. We hold a ceremony, we speak about the value of the person's life, we support the grieving family. The funeral is a powerful ritual that confirms the dignity and worth of the victim, completely independent of blame or punishment. The authors argue that if an AI causes harm and there is truly no human to blame, we can still develop new societal rituals, compensation funds, or public acknowledgements to validate the victim's status. We do not absolutely need a scapegoat to restore moral balance.
That is incredibly profound. We are so conditioned to link dignity with retribution. We think someone must suffer for the victim to be validated. But they are saying we can separate the two. We can fix the machine to handle the prevention, and we can use alternative societal mechanisms to handle the symbolic validation of the victim. Therefore, even if an ontological responsibility gap exists, it is not necessarily problematic because the core functions of responsibility, prevention, and dignity can be fulfilled through other means.
Exactly. But notice the careful language they use, which is crucial. They constantly say it does not necessarily exist and is not necessarily problematic. They are not claiming they have thoroughly solved the issue forever or completely overthrown Sparrow and Matthias. They are pointing out that the panic over the responsibility gap relies on very narrow assumptions about control and punishment. If you expand your view of how responsibility works, like the epilepsy driver, the gap shrinks. And if you expand your view of how society handles harm, like using technical fixes and non-punitive rituals, the gap loses its terrifying sting.
This really shifts the burden back onto us as a society, doesn't it? It reminds me of Hans Jonas and his monumental work, The Imperative of Responsibility. Jonas argued that as modern technology gives us godlike powers to alter the world, our traditional ethical frameworks have to evolve to match that scale. Lauwaert and Oimann seem to be doing exactly what Jonas called for. They are saying, don't just throw your hands up and say AI broke ethics. Instead, adapt the ethics. Recognize that deploying autonomous technology is a choice that carries inherent moral weight, and recognize that our societal response to harm might need to look different than an eye for an eye.
That is a perfect synthesis. Technology will continue to evolve, maybe even to a point where gradual functional replacement makes machines somewhat conscious. But until that distant sci-fi future arrives, the moral weight remains firmly on human shoulders. We cannot hide behind the unpredictability of the algorithms we choose to unleash.
What a phenomenal breakdown. We have covered a lot of ground today, from the distinction between causal and moral responsibility, to the epilepsy driver counterexample, to the philosophical meaning of funerals. The key takeaway from Lauwaert and Oimann is clear. The rise of autonomous AI does not mean the end of accountability. A responsibility gap does not necessarily exist, and even if it does, it is not necessarily the crisis we thought it was. We just need to think bigger about what responsibility actually means. Thank you so much for joining me to unpack this dense but vital topic. And thank you all for listening to Philosophical Frontiers. We will see you in the next episode.